Officer Brian Calloway had spent years believing he was untouchable. He wielded his badge like a weapon, bullying, harassing, and abusing his power, especially against black citizens. He thrived in a system that let him get away with it, using intimidation and force to silence those who dared to resist. So when he saw a black woman in court that day, he didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he grabbed her arm, shoved her, and humiliated her in front of the judge and the entire courtroom. He wanted to make one thing clear. He was in charge. But then something happened that made the entire room freeze. The woman calmly reached into her jacket. Calloway's instincts kicked in. He had seen this movement before. People reached into their pockets when they were about to pull a weapon. His fingers twitched, ready to escalate the situation even further. But instead of a weapon, she pulled out a badge. The courtroom fell silent. A heavy tension filled the air as Calloway staggered back, his face turning pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His arrogant smirk disappeared in an instant, because this wasn't just any black woman. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The judge, who had been preparing to give his final ruling, paused mid-motion, his gavel hovering in the air. Witnesses whispered among themselves, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, Calloway stood frozen, his usual confidence slipping away. He had testified in court dozens of times before, standing in that very spot, spinning his version of the truth, and watching the system back him up every time. He had arrested countless black men and women, throwing them into a system designed to break them. Today, he had assumed it would be no different. But then the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A woman entered, her presence commanding attention. She wore a sleek black suit, her movements precise and controlled. Her posture alone demanded respect. She wasn't just anyone. She took a seat in the gallery, her sharp eyes locking onto Calloway as he continued to spew his testimony. He noticed her immediately. His gaze flickered with irritation, then mild amusement. Another black woman, probably some relative of the defendant, hoping for a miracle. He smirked and turned his attention back to the judge. Then she stood up. Calloway stiffened. His amusement faded. Something about her, the way she carried herself, the authority in her posture, made him uneasy. "Sit down, lady," he barked, taking a few aggressive steps toward her. "This isn't your business." The woman met his glare, unmoved. "Excuse me?" Her voice was calm, but there was something in her tone, something sharp, something undeniable. And in that moment, Calloway realized his worst nightmare had just begun. Calloway scoffed, a smug grin spreading across his face. He thrived on moments like these, putting people like her in their place. He took another step forward, his voice dropping to a sneer. "You lost. This ain't the welfare office." A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge's gavel hovered in midair, his expression frozen in shock. A few people gasped audibly, their whispers filling the tense silence. But the woman in front of Calloway remained completely still. Her dark eyes, piercing and unreadable, never wavered. "Remove your hand," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Calloway's grip tightened around her arm. "Or what?" he spat, giving her a slight shove. A surge of power rushed through him. He had seen it 1,000 times, the way people like her shrunk away, intimidated, defeated. But she didn't. She didn't recoil. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she reached into her jacket. Calloway's instincts flared, his muscles tensed. He knew this move. A sudden reach, a quick motion. It was all the justification he needed to escalate. He had drawn his gun for less. The entire room held its breath. And then, she pulled out a badge. The air in the courtroom turned to ice. Calloway's smug grin evaporated. His fingers slipped from her arm as he staggered back a step. His face drained of color, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The badge gleamed under the overhead lights. But it wasn't just any badge. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice unwavering as she spoke. "Officer Calloway, I am Chief Naomi Sinclair." The silence was deafening. Every word sliced through the room like a blade. "And as of this morning," she continued, her eyes locked onto his, "I am your new boss." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and whispers flooded the room. The weight of the moment crashed down on Calloway like an avalanche. Frozen in place, his lips parted, but no words came out. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. His unchecked power, his arrogance, the years of getting away with everything. They had all just come to a screeching halt. The judge slammed his gavel down at last, but the sound was swallowed by the uproar. The world as Calloway knew it had just changed forever. Over the courtroom, Officer Brian Calloway's breath hitched, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. His world, his unchecked power, had been built on the belief that people like Chief Naomi Sinclair didn't exist. A black woman, composed, unshaken, and more powerful than him. His chief. Sinclair stood tall, her badge still gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light. Calloway's fingers twitched at his sides, his face contorting as he fought to regain control. No, this couldn't be happening. The judge tapped his gavel. Order in the court, he commanded, but even he couldn't mask the intrigue simmering beneath his voice. Sinclair turned toward him. Your Honor, I request a private discussion regarding Officer Calloway's conduct, both today and throughout his career. I believe it is relevant to these proceedings. A heavy silence filled the room. Calloway could practically feel the power slipping from his grasp. The judge hesitated, studying Sinclair. Calloway clenched his jaw. He had always been the one with the advantage, the one people listened to. But now the judge was actually considering her request. Very well, Chief Sinclair, the judge finally said. We will recess for 15 minutes. Calloway felt the air leave his lungs. This wasn't just a humiliation. This was the beginning of something far worse. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Sinclair turned and locked eyes with him. The intensity in her gaze made him feel smaller than he ever had in his entire career. Naomi Sinclair hadn't always worn a badge. She was born and raised in Ridgewood, Georgia, a city that had failed so many like her. She saw firsthand how the system worked, not for people who looked like her, but against them. Her father, a local pastor, preached about justice, but he also knew justice was rare for black families in their neighborhood. When Naomi was 16, she witnessed something that would change her forever. Her older brother, Michael Sinclair, was pulled over for matching a description. She stood frozen, clutching their mother's hand as officers dragged him from his car, slammed him against the hood, and threw him in cuffs. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that hadn't mattered. And that night, Naomi made a decision. If the system was built to keep people like her powerless, she would get inside it, and she would tear it down from within. That night had shaped Naomi Sinclair. She understood, even at 16, that the only way to fight a corrupt system was to get inside it and dismantle it from within. Despite every obstacle, racism at the academy, white officers doubting her authority, superiors questioning her decisions, she climbed the ranks, refusing to be broken. And now she was here, the first black female police chief in Ridgewood's history. Her first order of business? Cleaning out the rot. Back in the courtroom, Officer Brian Calloway paced the empty aisle, his pulse hammering in his throat. He needed to fix this, fast. He had connections, powerful people who had protected him for years. This wasn't supposed to happen. He grabbed his phone, quickly dialing a number. Yeah, it's me, he whispered when the line picked up. We have a problem. Meanwhile, Chief Sinclair sat in a private room with the judge and the defense attorney. Your Honor, she said, placing a thick folder on the table. Before we continue with Darius Mitchell's case, I need you to see something. The judge opened it. Inside were pages of complaints, lawsuits, excessive force reports, all with one name attached. Officer Brian Calloway. The judge's face darkened. Why haven't I seen this before? Because Calloway was protected, Sinclair said simply. She folded her arms, but not anymore. A knock at the door. An officer stepped in, looking uneasy. Chief Sinclair, he said hesitantly, you might want to see this. Sinclair followed him into the hallway. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, cameras flashing, and at the center of it all, Calloway. Flanked by a lawyer and a few high-ranking officers, he was speaking into a microphone, spinning his narrative. This is a political hit job, Calloway declared. I have done nothing wrong. I am being targeted because I uphold the law. Sinclair's jaw tightened. Of course he was going to fight this. But that was fine, because she was ready. Standing at the courthouse entrance, she watched as Calloway painted himself as the victim, playing to the cameras, trying to turn public sympathy in his favor. What he didn't realize was that his time was up, and Naomi Sinclair wasn't going to let him lie his way out of this one. Brian Calloway stood at the courthouse steps, his voice steady, his expression rehearsed. This is what happens when you do your job, he said, shaking his head in feigned frustration. I've spent years protecting this city, putting criminals behind bars, and now, because of political games, my career is being destroyed. His lawyer nodded beside him, while the high-ranking officers flanking him stood in careful silence, unwilling to openly align themselves, but not yet abandoning him either. Calloway knew how this worked. He had seen officers before him spin their downfall into martyrdom. He wasn't about to go down without a fight. Chief Naomi Sinclair watched from the courthouse entrance, her fists clenching at her sides. She had seen it before, how men like him twisted reality, painting themselves as victims while burying the truth beneath their lies. But not this time. She turned on her heels and re-entered the courthouse, because inside the real battle was about to begin. As Sinclair stepped back into the courtroom, her phone vibrated. A message from Internal Affairs. Be careful. Calloway still has people protecting him. She sighed, already knowing this fight wouldn't be easy. But she had prepared for this moment for years. The judge called the session back to order, his gaze flicking between Calloway and Sinclair. Chief Sinclair, he said, tapping his fingers against his desk, I've reviewed the documents you provided. These are serious allegations. Calloway leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, confidence returning. Allegations, Your Honor, he said smoothly. Nothing proven. And let's be honest, the chief here seems to have a personal vendetta against me. Sinclair stepped forward. It's not personal, Officer Calloway, it's justice. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I request that all of Officer Calloway's past excessive force cases be reopened, starting with the case of Darius Mitchell. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Calloway's jaw tightened. The judge nodded. I will take that into consideration. But I must warn you, Chief Sinclair, reopening these cases will be an uphill battle. Sinclair didn't hesitate. I understand, Your Honor, but it's a battle worth fighting. Brian Calloway could feel his power slipping away, and he would not let that happen. Pacing outside the courthouse, he pressed his phone to his ear, his voice sharp with desperation. Find me something on her, he barked. Anything. I don't care if you have to dig up her kindergarten report card. The voice on the other end hesitated. Calloway, you don't get it. This isn't just some political stunt. Sinclair's got evidence. Real evidence. Calloway sneered. Then we make sure no one sees it. That night, a masked figure broke into Ridgewood Police Department's internal evidence room. Files were pulled. Computers were wiped. By morning, the case against Calloway was thinner. Critical documents vanished. But Naomi Sinclair had anticipated this. When she arrived at the station, she found her office ransacked, papers scattered across the floor. On her desk sat a single sheet of paper. A warning. Back off. Sinclair picked up the paper, reading it slowly. Then she smiled. Calloway had just made a fatal mistake. She turned to her assistant. Get me a warrant. I know exactly where to look. The morning air was thick with tension as Sinclair stood outside the courthouse, her fingers wrapped around a fresh warrant. The break-in at the evidence room had been a desperate move. Calloway was panicking, and when men like him panicked, they got sloppy. Her gut told her that Calloway had an insurance policy, a place where he kept the real dirt hidden, and she knew exactly where to find it. Sinclair and her team pulled up to an unassuming storage facility on the outskirts of Ridgewood. A rusted metal door stood before them, Calloway's off-duty storage unit. Armed with a search warrant, officers cut the lock and pulled the door open. Inside, boxes of files lined the walls, old case documents, and something far worse. Sinclair's breath caught in her throat as she spotted a stack of VHS tapes and USB drives, each labeled with a name, all victims of Officer Brian Calloway. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a tape labeled Darius Mitchell, 2017. She knew in that moment, Jamal Harris, 2027. Naomi Sinclair knew that name, a black teenager, just 18, who had been killed during a routine traffic stop. Brian Calloway had claimed Jamal reached for a weapon. The case had been buried, deemed justified, dismissed with no body cam footage available. But now the missing footage was right in front of her. Her hands shook as she plugged the USB drive into her laptop. Her team huddled around her. The screen flickered to life, and the truth was worse than she ever imagined. The footage was from Calloway's own body cam. It showed everything. Calloway standing over Jamal's lifeless body. Calloway reaching into his own jacket. Calloway pulling out a gun and casually dropping it next to Jamal's hand. Then his voice, cold, detached, as he called it in. Suspect reached for a weapon. Officer discharged firearm in self-defense. No hesitation, no remorse. Just another cover-up in a long, ugly list. The room went silent. One of the officers, a young recruit, swallowed hard. Jesus Christ, he whispered. Sinclair's jaw tightened. She had always known Calloway was corrupt. But this was murder. And now she had the proof to bring him down. Meanwhile, Calloway sat in a dimly lit bar, swirling whiskey in his glass. His phone buzzed. It was his contact from the evidence room. "We have a problem." Calloway stiffened. "What do you mean?" A pause. "They found the tapes. They found everything." The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. No, that's impossible." His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. His world, the world where he was untouchable, was crumbling around him. That evening, Naomi Sinclair stood on the steps of Ridgewood Police Department, facing a sea of reporters. In her hand, she held a single USB drive. She raised it high for everyone to see. "In my hands," she said, "is undeniable proof that Officer Brian Calloway has falsified reports, planted evidence, and covered up his crimes, including the murder of Jamal Harris." A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. The world was about to know everything. And Calloway? He had nowhere left to hide. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scrambled forward, shoving microphones closer, their voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions. Flashbulbs burst in rapid succession, capturing every second of the moment. Brian Calloway watched from a distance. His stomach dropped. She wasn't stopping. For the first time in his career, he had no way out. The press conference was everywhere. Every news station, every website, every social media feed flooded with the same breaking headline. Officer Brian Calloway exposed. Secret footage reveals murder cover-up. Naomi Sinclair stood firm as cameras zoomed in, her expression unyielding. Her voice was steady, unshaken. "This is not just about one bad cop," she said. "This is about a system that allowed him to operate without consequence for years. That ends now." Calloway sat frozen in his car, parked in an empty lot on the outskirts of Ridgewood. His phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from fellow officers, his superiors, the union. Some told him to lay low. Others were cutting ties entirely. His jaw clenched. His grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. They were abandoning him. The very system that had protected him for so long, the same system he had relied on to cover up his crimes, was now turning its back on him. Then the final blow. His lawyer called. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Brian, the department is moving to suspend you indefinitely, without pay." Calloway's stomach twisted. "They can't do that," he hissed. "I have connections. I have leverage." A long pause. "They have the video, Brian," his lawyer finally said. "It's indisputable." Calloway's breath came in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't happening. He needed a way out. Desperation breeds recklessness. Calloway stormed into his last stronghold, the Ridgewood Police Union office. He burst through the doors, his voice echoing off the walls. "You can't just throw me to the wolves," he spat. "I did what I had to do." But the faces staring back at him were unreadable, and for the first time, Calloway realized he was alone. "The streets are safer because of me," Calloway barked, his voice rising. But the men inside the Ridgewood Police Union office, the same ones who once laughed at his racist jokes, who covered for his brutality, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older officer cleared his throat. "Brian, you need to get out in front of this," he said cautiously. "Deny it. Say the footage was edited." Calloway's eyes flashed with rage. "Are you serious?" he snapped, his voice cracking. "You think a fake video excuse is going to hold up? Sinclair has the public eating out of her damn hands. If we don't shut this down now, we're all next." A younger officer shook his head. "No, Calloway, you're next. We're not risking our careers for you." A heavy silence settled over the room, and that was the moment Calloway's blood ran cold. They were done protecting him. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be powerless. But Naomi Sinclair wasn't done. That night, she issued an official warrant for Calloway's arrest. At dawn, officers arrived at his house, banging on the door. But Calloway was already gone. By the time they breached the front entrance, his car was missing from the driveway. He had disappeared. A full-blown manhunt was now underway. Sinclair's phone buzzed. An unknown number. A text message. "You think you've won. This isn't over." She smirked, locking her phone. Oh, but it was only just beginning. The city was on high alert. Every news station ran breaking reports. Fugitive cop on the run after murder cover-up exposed. Helicopters hovered overhead as officers combed the streets. Every highway checkpoint, every airport, every bus station. Calloway had nowhere to go. But Sinclair knew him. She knew exactly where he'd run. Because a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous of all. There was only one thing left. Revenge. Brian Calloway had lost everything. His badge, his reputation, his allies. But even as he ran, even as the world turned against him, he had one last illusion to cling to. The idea that he could still win. But Naomi Sinclair knew better. Standing outside an abandoned warehouse near the Ridgewood docks, she tightened her grip on her weapon. She had anticipated this moment. Calloway was too arrogant to stay hidden forever. He wouldn't go out quietly. Her phone rang. The number was blocked, but she didn't hesitate before answering. "I know you're looking for me, Sinclair." Calloway's voice rasped through the speaker. Sinclair didn't blink. "I do, actually," she said calmly. "It ends with you in cuffs." A low, cruel chuckle. "You think you've won? You think bringing me down changes anything? The system made me, and when I'm gone, someone just like me will take my place." Sinclair's jaw tightened. "No, Calloway, the system lets you exist, but change starts today." A rustling sound. Then the line went dead. She exhaled slowly. He was close. Inside the darkened warehouse, Calloway crouched behind a stack of crates, gripping his stolen service weapon. His breath was shallow. His hands were unsteady. He could hear the footsteps. She had come alone. Good. Naomi stepped into the dimly lit space, her silhouette sharp and unwavering. "Calloway, it's over." His voice was low, shaking with rage. "You ruined my life." Sinclair shook her head. "No, you did that." A tense silence. Then Calloway lunged from the shadows, gun raised. Bang! A single gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Calloway staggered back, his gun clattering to the floor. A red stain spread across his shoulder. His breathing turned ragged as he collapsed against a crate, pain contorting his face. Sinclair's gun remained steady in her hands. "I told you it was over." Police sirens wailed outside. The doors burst open and officers flooded in, surrounding Calloway. For the first time, he had no power, no control. One of the arresting officers read him his rights, the same words Calloway had coldly recited to countless innocent men before. As they dragged him away, Calloway lifted his head, locking eyes with Sinclair one last time. Pure hatred. But beneath it, fear. The night air was thick with the hum of police sirens. Brian Calloway sat in the back of a squad car, his hands cuffed, his once-pressed uniform replaced by a blood-stained shirt. The bullet wound in his shoulder throbbed, but it wasn't the pain that consumed him. It was the silence. The same system that once protected him had now discarded him like garbage. He had thought himself untouchable. Now he was just another criminal. Across the lot, Naomi Sinclair watched as officers secured the warehouse, marking it as an active crime scene. She didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, watching the man who had terrorized so many finally meet his downfall. As they prepared to transport Calloway, he finally broke his silence. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, his voice raw with fury. "You think locking me up makes a damn difference? There's always going to be another cop like me, Sinclair. You can't change the system." Sinclair stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You're right about one thing, Calloway." He smirked, about to respond, but then she continued, "There will always be men like you, but from now on, there will also be people like me, and we're not afraid of you anymore." The smirk vanished. For the first time, Calloway looked truly afraid. Weeks later, the courthouse was packed. The trial of Brian Calloway had become national news. The prosecution laid out every crime, every cover-up, every lie. The evidence was undeniable. The body cam footage of Jamal Harris, the hidden records from his storage unit, The witness testimonies of victims who had suffered at his hands. One by one, they took the stand. Darius Mitchell's mother, voice shaking as she recalled how Calloway had ripped her son away from her. A former officer, admitting how Calloway had threatened those who dared speak out against him. Even members of the Ridgewood Police Department testified, distancing themselves from the man they once called brother. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room held its breath. Guilty on all counts. A collective exhale rippled through the crowd. The judge's gavel slammed down. Brian Calloway, you are sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole. A wave of emotion surged through the courtroom. Some wept, others cheered. Sinclair simply closed her eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Justice had been served, but the fight was far from over. Brian Calloway's conviction set off a domino effect. Other officers resigned in disgrace. Investigations into department-wide corruption intensified. New policies were enacted. Body cams became mandatory. Civilian oversight committees were formed. For the first time in years, the people of Ridgewood felt hope. Sinclair sat in her office, staring at her badge. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As she reached for her phone, a new message appeared on the screen. One down. Many more to go. She exhaled, straightened her shoulders, and got back to work. Lessons from the fall of Officer Brian Calloway. A deep analysis. The downfall of Officer Brian Calloway is more than just the story of a corrupt cop being brought to justice. It is a reflection of a deep-rooted system that allowed individuals like him to operate without consequence for years. His arrest, trial, and conviction represent a shift in accountability, a warning to those who have abused their power, and a call to action for those still fighting for true justice and reform. This case highlights several critical lessons, both from a societal perspective and a personal standpoint. The downfall of Officer Brian Calloway is more than just the story of one corrupt cop getting what he deserved. It is a reflection of a deeply flawed system, a hard-earned victory for justice, and a blueprint for change in law enforcement. There are several key lessons from this case, each shedding light on different aspects of power, corruption, accountability, and reform. For years, Calloway abused his authority, knowing that the system would protect him. His crimes were not committed in secrecy. His colleagues, his superiors, and even the union knew about his actions. Yet, he remained untouched. This is because institutions tend to protect their own. Corrupt officers like Calloway exist not just because they choose to act unjustly, but because they are allowed to. The blue wall of silence, an unwritten rule among police officers to cover for each other, makes it almost impossible to hold bad cops accountable. This case shows why that culture must change. What ultimately brought Calloway down was undeniable proof. For years, accusations against him had been dismissed as hearsay. Victims had spoken up, but without solid evidence, their voices were ignored. That changed the moment Naomi Sinclair uncovered the hidden footage. Video evidence doesn't lie. It exposed his crimes in real time, forcing the public, the courts, and even his own allies to turn against him. This case highlights the critical importance of transparency in policing. If body cameras had been mandatory earlier, Calloway's actions would have been exposed years before. The more transparency we have in law enforcement, the harder it becomes for corruption to thrive. Calloway believed he was untouchable because, for years, he was. His downfall wasn't just about one bad officer, it was about a system that enabled him. But systems, no matter how corrupt, can be changed. Sinclair's leadership forced the department to reevaluate itself. In response to the scandal, several officers resigned. Investigations were opened into other officers with excessive force complaints, and policies changed, ensuring mandatory body cams and independent civilian oversight. This proves that reform is possible. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with accountability. Naomi Sinclair was not the first person to know about Calloway's corruption, but she was the first with enough courage to take him down. Her journey was not easy. She faced resistance from within the department, threats, and even attempts to destroy evidence. But she persisted. She proves that one person in a position of power can create real change if they are willing to fight for it. Her story serves as a powerful example for leaders, whistleblowers, and reformers everywhere. One of the biggest turning points in this case was the press conference, where Sinclair publicly exposed Calloway. The moment the public became aware, Calloway lost his protection. Why? Because public pressure forces institutions to act. If the media had ignored the story, if the community had remained silent, Calloway might have walked free. Instead, people demanded justice. This teaches us an important lesson. Change does not come just from within the system. It comes from the people demanding it. Activists, journalists, and everyday citizens all played a role in ensuring Calloway faced justice. This is why speaking up matters, holding those in power accountable, everyone's responsibility. And when people unite for justice, even the most corrupt figures can fall. Some might see Calloway's downfall as revenge, but that's not what this was about. Sinclair did not pursue Calloway out of personal hatred. She pursued him because justice demands accountability. The goal was never just to punish Calloway. It was to expose the truth, set a precedent, and prevent others from abusing their power the way he did. Calloway was right about one thing. There will always be men like him. But Sinclair was also right. Now there will be more people willing to fight back. The case of Brian Calloway is not just a story of corruption and justice, it is a blueprint for change. It shows us that corruption thrives in secrecy, but collapses under transparency. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. One person can make a difference, but real change requires collective action. Most importantly, it reminds us that justice is a fight that never truly ends. Calloway was brought down, but there are others like him still out there. And as long as people like Sinclair exist, as long as communities refuse to stay silent, as long as the truth is exposed, justice will always have a chance to prevail. Because real change doesn't come from a single victory, it comes from the fight that follows. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in truth, accountability, and justice, then don't stay silent. Help spread the message. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with others. The more people know, the harder it is for corruption to hide. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. And remember, justice isn't just an idea, it's a fight worth having. Let's keep pushing forward.